Welcome back to the Charles Billingsley podcast, and we are just so excited about today's guest. I've been waiting for this for a few weeks, Charles.
Yeah, we've been excited about this one. This lady is amazing, with an incredible story, but so many gifts. With her talents and abilities, and now she's an author. It's amazing how so many great things come from tragedy, but nobody would ever wish in a million years upon anybody what Michelle has been through. But through it all, she's triumphing, and it's really, really inspirational. So I'm excited to introduce her. You want to introduce her, Adam?
Please welcome. I'm doing my best welcome announcer voice. I'm just kidding. I won't do that. Please welcome Michelle Hord to the program.
Yeah.
Great to have you.
Thank you. Gee, I thought I'd won a prize there for a minute, Adam. I didn't know what was going on.
You won first place in our hearts.
Oh, charmer.
I got to tell you, Michelle, I'm just, as I was reading and listening and learning a little bit about you, I love it because I come from a television producer background, and you do too. Maybe you can just share a little bit about your background as, what you kind of grew up. You grew up in the Midwest, I believe. Tell us about that and how you got into TV.
Absolutely. Well, I was born in Indiana, and my parents met because my grandfather was the pastor of a Baptist church in Terre Haute, Indiana, and my mom came to go to school there and went to the church across the street and met the preacher's kid, and that's how I got here. And I grew up loving storytelling, writing, and went to college to study broadcast journalism. And my first job out of college was working for a show called America's Most Wanted, which has made a comeback in recent years. And really, if you think about it, was ahead of its time. I mean, when you think about before technology, all of that sort of stuff. But that was my first job. And there were some really, it's so funny how God uses things. It certainly wasn't my first choice, but it was there. I was making $19,000 a year, which at the time was a decent amount of money for a kid coming out of school, in television, and it had benefits, which my parents really liked. But what I found was, because we were meeting people at the worst moments of their lives, my first big promotion was covering missing children's stories. So I spent a lot of time in that space, and it's just unlike anything in the world to be with a parent at that horrible nightmare moment of not knowing what's happened to their child.
Yeah, you probably spent a lot of time with those guests on that TV program. You saw a lot of heartache.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But the other thing I saw, and I was young, I was in my early 20s. And in fact, my boss at one point said to me, "Kid, it's a good thing you're not married and don't have kids yet, or this job would be impossible." And I didn't quite understand it then. I understood it when I was a little older. But because it was John Walsh, and people really respected, because of his own tragedy and some of the work he'd done, respected him. When I showed up, it wasn't like I was a press. It was like I was social worker slash, therapist slash, nonprofit. So the families really let us in to their homes, literally and figuratively, in a way that the regular media did not. And I was just always astonished at how the human spirit can rise to the occasion in the worst of circumstances.
So you were able to actually help counsel some of these grieving parents and family members through their grief in the midst of producing television program, weren't you?
Yes. So it felt important.
Yeah, it was. And you didn't stay there forever, because then you went on and you got promoted to another job, didn't you?
Yes. So I've worked at several places throughout my career so far. I've been in the business for 30 years. So I like to say I started when I was 2. But I worked at the Oprah Winfrey Show. I worked for CBS 48 Hours. I worked for years at Good Morning America, was an executive at NBC Universal for about a decade. So I've spent some really great time and have been blessed with some great opportunities.
Really? Wow. You kind of went from there. Charles, were you going to ask something there?
No, I just knew that, at some point you're just, you're enjoying this wonderful career, and you got married and
Yes.
had a daughter, and things are just rocking right along. And then things took a turn, didn't they?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I didn't get married until I was 37. I was a career girl, enjoying my career, and wound up marrying someone I'd known for a really long time. He had gone to college with my brother. And so, ironically, in retrospect, there was a feeling of safety. And security, because this was a friend who I'd known for a long time. And at the age of 39, I gave birth to a healthy, beautiful little girl, Gabrielle, which, another miracle of God. I had been told very often in my young adult years that I may not be able to have children. So to have her naturally have a wonderful pregnancy was just the joy of my life. And like, some of us experience when we get into relationships and people start to grow, they change. And over time, after lots of counseling and Christian counseling and prayer, it became really clear to me that the relationship with my husband was not where I thought God wanted me to be in my life, and certainly not what I wanted my daughter to see in terms of how couples relate to one another. So I asked for a divorce. And within, it was tumultuous for anyone that's gone through a divorce that's listening. I don't think, unless you've dealt with it, someone you think you've known or have known, it just gets incredibly ugly and can, over money and superficial things. And so after 6 months of this back and forth, where I literally moved out of the house because of the friction, my then husband agreed to sign the divorce agreement. And I remember going home that night and just being so grateful, and all my prayer partners and prayer warriors, like this was a new beginning. And the last thing he said to me was, "I'm sorry for, everything that happened during this process." And I said, "It doesn't matter. We love our daughter. The most important thing is that we continue to be friends and co-parent." Mm-hmm. And then the next day I received a call that is unlike a call any parent can imagine.
Yeah.
What do you remember about when that call came in?
I was actually not in my office. I was at a conference center facilitating, but because I was a mother of a 7-year-old, my phone was like a third arm, it was always very close. And I saw, as I darted my eyes quickly, that I had just missed a call from our caregiver, who was actually a deacon at our church. And so anytime the nanny's name comes up, especially right during school hours, you sort of jump to. And so I called her back, and she was screaming. And it was clear that when she walked into our family house that day, she had walked into a crime scene, and she wasn't exactly sure what had happened yet. But I just told her to get out of the house and call 911. And initially, my thought was Gabrielle was at school. How was I going to explain this to her? I assumed her father had hurt himself, perhaps killed himself. And then I got this sinking feeling and called a dear friend who was a fellow mom who was always there at school during the day, and asked if she had seen Gabrielle that day, and she had not. Mm-hmm. And at that point, I went and found a little closet and got on my knees and shut the door and said, "God, I don't know what I'm going to walk into, but whatever it is, please just give me the strength to handle it." And that was the beginning of a completely different life for me.
Wow. Did you say I knew you said you were doing a conference, but were you in town or out of town?
I was in New York. I was in town. I lived I lived in the suburbs of New York, and, trying to get during rush hour somewhere was the longest ride of my entire life. And, an hour plus later, I pulled up to a street that had police tape and, an ambulance and police lights and people standing around. And the very first person I saw was my pastor. And as a reporter, I had driven up to that scene more times than I cared to imagine. So it was, I don't even know if surreal is articulate enough of just that experience alone, before getting out the car and discovering that my daughter had been murdered and that her father was in police custody.
So he had not committed suicide as well. So you have to deal with that.
Yes. Yes.
What in the world. How do you deal with that in the moment?
In the moment, I think I probably said some unchristian things to my pastor, if I remember correctly, to which I believe he agreed. To add a little levity to the moment, if I may. But, it was so impossible. It was so impossible. It was not, clearly it wasn't a marriage I wanted to be in anymore, but there was no abuse. There was no threat of abuse. And had I ever been worried about anything, which I wasn't, it would have been me. His anger at me for changing and changing the construct for him. This was someone who I knew to love his daughter. So I remember as I was being driven away from the crime scene, Googling a verse in Job that I wanted to make sure I had committed correctly to my brain. Though he slay me, yet will I trust him. And I remember that night on my knees with friends, crying and praying and saying it over and over. And it became my battle cry, because what was clear to me was that whatever God had for me to do in this world had to be so powerful that the devil came at me with everything he had. And I was not going to allow my faith to be moved. And I was not going to allow my daughter's memory to be tainted by falling victim to that.
So when you arrived at the scene, you said they had your husband in custody. Had he come back to the scene himself, or was he there the entire time?
He had never left. He had injured himself in a way to try to make it look like he had tried to kill himself. But it was clear that was not the case. He had, frankly, what I didn't know at the time was that, one, I didn't know my daughter didn't go to school because I didn't receive a call from the school that she had an unexcused absence. And two, I didn't know that our caregiver had been called and told, don't come today. You don't need to come today because Gabrielle's homesick. And despite that, she went to the house to try to get started on some laundry, and she surprised him. And so law enforcement felt like he was probably waiting for me. She disrupted his plan and started to come up with a bunch of different stories about what supposedly did or didn't happen. But the plan had been for me to come over that day and for us to talk to Gabrielle more in depth about the next steps with the divorce.
Wow.
We were doing years ago, I was doing a video shoot with some parents who they had lost their child to cancer. And the dad said this line, and it's always stuck with me. He said, there's nothing that goes against the order of the universe more than when a parent loses a child. Mm-hmm. What has been one of the biggest thoughts or way of processing through losing a child that you've taken hold of that you could pass along to people who may be listening and they've gone through it, or they're in the process of going through it and they're just not sure how to cope with everything, how to process all of the grief?
No, absolutely. One of the first things I did was get a trauma therapist, because I had dealt with grief and bereavement before. I lost my mother and my grandmother when I was 24, within 3 months of each other, both from illness, although my mother's, was completely unexpected. And so I understood grief, but the trauma, when you deal with violence, and now I'm dealing with law enforcement and courts and that sort of thing. And my trauma therapist said to me, there is no playbook. And so I think that's important, because survival can look different every day. It's been more than 5 years. And as I sit here and talk to you gentlemen, my heart's racing a bit. Some days are still easier or tougher than others. So I would just say to all of the parents out there who may be experiencing this, that God is bigger than our weakness, than our pain, than our broken hearts, and give yourself the grace to do what you need to do to get through today. If that's laying in bed all day, or if that's going out and running a marathon, people process grief differently, and just give yourself the grace to do what you need to do for you. And then also to allow others in to help you. In any way they can. It's actually a gift you give to people who love you and feel helpless, who are around you.
That's a great spot and a great way to go into our quick break that we're going to have. And again, I love the verse, Job 13:15, where Job says, though he slay me, yet I will trust him. And that one word, yet, is what we're going to come back and talk about. We'll be back on the Charles Billingsley podcast.
Well, welcome back to the Charles Billingsley podcast. We're talking to Michelle Hord and her incredible story, a heartbreaking story that nobody in a million years would ever want to live through. But through it all, as so many overcomers do, you've been able to walk through this tragedy with your head still held high and your heart still intact. And now you have really taken this tragedy and created an entire new life that's being built from it. And like you said earlier before we went to break, it's been 5 years, but it's I don't know if you ever really get over anything like this. The scar is going to be there a long, long time. But one thing that was a reminder for me, scars are difficult to bear because they're reminders of all the pain. But the other thing that's beautiful about scars is that it also reminds you that even though it's always going to be there, it has healed over it to a certain extent. And you are in a situation now, 5 years later, where the healing is still taking place. It's still really fresh. And I'm sure there's not a day that goes by that this doesn't pop up to the forefront of your heart and mind at some point. And as a result, you've written this wonderful book called The Other Side of Yet. The subtitle is Finding Light in the Midst of Darkness. And there's some really wonderful chapters. Adam asked you a little bit before at the break about some things you had learned, and you touched on a little bit, but if it's okay for the next few moments, let's go a little deeper into some of that stuff. Some of the first few chapters are entitled Face the Dark, Come to Terms, Keep Moving, which is a wonderful chapter. Is there any of the first few chapters that you want to just highlight for us so that when people download or go get this book, they have this to look forward to?
Thank you. Well, I'll start with the title, if I may, and it comes from the verse that we were speaking about a few minutes ago, though he slay me, yet do I trust him. And you know that you trust God. You know that the songs you learned and the verses you learned in Sunday school are true in your heart. And then you're at this intersection where things all of a sudden look different. And thank goodness most people don't have my personal story of losing a child to violence, but we all have those yet moments where what we knew before in life has changed, whether that's a hurricane, COVID, divorce, disease. We all have these moments where, gosh, I thought my life was going to look like X and it doesn't anymore. And in that moment, if we are willing to be obedient, God gives us a yet opportunity to pivot and to have a different life, perhaps not the one you imagined, but he can bring new joy. He can do a new thing, which is part of one of my other favorite verses in the Bible, that he will do a new thing. Mm-hmm. So those early chapters are really about when something happens. I think it's so important to, as quickly as possible, be honest with yourself. This is more than I can bear. This is my worst nightmare. I'm angry. Whatever those feelings are, allow yourself to feel them. Allow yourself to pray and talk to God about them, so that as you begin to just deal with the reality in front of you in those first minutes, hours, and days, that you start off with your base camp supplies, for lack of a better word, of faith and family going with you.
How did you get past the fact that you could say, I've done everything right. I've been a good wife. I've been a good mother. I've tried to, even in the midst of this divorce that I've tried to treat him with respect, even through this. And God, I don't deserve this. There's no way that I deserve. How did you get past that?
Mm-hmm.
I started reading Job. Honest to goodness, the next morning I started Job, and I would never be as
Mhm.
Crazy is to compare myself to Job, but you pick up your Bible and thumb through and pick any page, and you'll find someone who is confronted with something greater than they can imagine, either them conquering, overcoming, whether it be by their own hand or their own sin or by catastrophe or something that happens to them. And God challenges them to not trust in their own understanding, but to lean into him. And so for me to say, why me, would require me to say that means someone else deserved this. And it is difficult, right? You almost go back to childhood of like, well, it's not fair. Well, whoever told you? Maybe it's the Midwest girl in me, but life is hard. There is suffering in this world. We are taught there's suffering in this world. There is no situation where a beautiful, healthy 7-year-old little girl who was kind and loved Sunday school and was excited about getting baptized deserved this. There's nothing that will make it make sense. So I think especially in these type of extraordinary circumstances, whether they're natural or man-made disasters, to be able to say, sometimes there is not an explanation. On this side of the Jordan, this will never, I will never understand this. I do know there's evil in the universe. I know there are weak people. I know that the devil is powerful. We don't like to talk about evil as much as we like to talk about God's goodness because it's scary, but it's real. And so for me, that was important, was to, and listen, I still struggle every day with memories, with traumatic memories, with, what ifs. But I had to, in my heart, reconcile that this had happened. There was no going back. And that the best thing I could do for Gabrielle was to fight for justice and to fight to try to make her name bigger than what happened to her.
Mm. I want to ask you a hard question, and you don't have to answer. We can edit out whatever we need to edit out. But I'm sitting here wondering, at some point, because of trials and everything else, you've had to face your husband, I would assume. How have you been able to deal with that? And have you come to terms with that?
I've had to face him in courtrooms, because after all of this happened, I fought for 2 years just to get divorced. And it took 2 years for the murder trial to happen. And there was that human traumatic fear where I was grateful to have the support of my church and my family and my therapist to literally be able to see his face, to get on a witness stand and to point to him, to give my testimony. But then there is coming to terms with what happened. And people often talk about forgiveness. And this is me personally. I don't know if we can't know God's heart, but for me personally, this was someone who willingly did something that he confessed to and then denied in court and fought to plead not guilty, and who clearly is disturbed and deranged and not the person I knew. And so the person I knew doesn't exist anymore. I didn't even use his name in the book. So to forgive him for me was not the priority, because to me, forgiveness is about letting go of something, letting go of pain that you're holding, right? It's your poison. That wasn't what I grappled with. What I grappled with was someone in my life that I knew because of him, who I loved, and that was his mother, who was Gabrielle's living grandmother, who was like a second mother to me. And her child did this. And he looked like her, he sounded like her. And after the trial, after it was safe for me to have contact with her again, we have reconciled. And not only have we reconciled, I cook for her like I used to several years ago. We go to church together on Sunday. So for me, reconciliation was important, to not let the devil take anything else away, and to focus on what remained. And I think that when you're dealing with loss, there are those things you need to leave behind for your own mental health, physical health, right? And then there are those things that you need to take with you and be brave enough to say, God, I feel like this person, this situation, that this is something that I want to continue to have as part of my life. And my relationship with my former mother-in-law is one of those things.
Wow.
One chapter ends section 1 and picks up section 2, but the way they go together, I thought was really great. So chapter 12, accept what was lost, and the beginning of section 2 is dare to turn the page.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of people can get to accept what was lost and get stuck. The story about the car that was yours when the incident took place, and the struggle you went through. And I'm kind of the same way. I'm not like, I don't love things, but things hold memories sometimes. And so it'll be time to throw something away. And Lisa was like, hey, can we get rid of this? My wife. And I'm like, okay. I mean, the only thing that wasn't like that was when I was able to take the diaper bin, the thing that you put all the dirty diapers in. We had 4 kids over the course of a decade. The night I walked that out to the trash, I ran a lap around that.
Yeah.
I was so happy. But
Speaking in tongues.
yeah, yes. So tell us a little bit about that experience.
About letting go.
And then what's the next step to turn the page?
There are those things, whether they're physical or emotional, that you have to let go to. That story in the book alludes to the car that I had when Gabrielle was murdered. And when I had to turn it in for the lease, I struggled because it was one of those things that still, it's somewhere she sat. I had memories. And especially because it was a crime and it happened in her bedroom, I lost a lot of her things to police evidence. So the things that she had touched and that I had shared experience and memory with her became very important to me. And at the same time, there are things that no one can take away, right? My memories of her, the relationship I have with her still, my hope and excitement to know that I will get to see her again someday. And so I think part of moving on, probably the most difficult thing, is once you've admitted that it has happened, whatever it is, to say, yet God, I pray that you can show me something new. And you don't even have to know what it is. I just knew that I needed to keep moving. And I knew that I was raised in a home where giving back was important. So one of the first things I started doing was looking for opportunities to help other children my daughter's age. And that gave me joy to see the look in little kids' eyes that reminded me of my baby. So I didn't know where I was going, but I knew what I was walking away from, and I knew what I needed to take with me. And that's all you need to know in the moment. Breathe, pray, cry, and just take one step at a time.
Well, and declaring that defiant faith that you talk about, I believe it's chapter 13. And it's incredible because you're now putting that faith into action. Because you wanted to do something to help other girls and other kids around the age of Gabrielle. And then suddenly you just had this vision to do these playgrounds. And it's the coolest thing because every playground that gets built now is another beautiful picture of the memory of Gabrielle. Tell us about what you're doing with this incredible new venture.
Yes, thank you. Well, it's called Gabrielle's Wings because one, she loved butterflies, and there is the butterfly effect that says a small thing can make a huge impact. And also because I imagine her with her little angel wings. And our focus is on elementary age children in underserved communities, Black and brown children who, like my daughter, who look like my daughter, but frankly would not have had some of the opportunities that she had to go to certain types of schools and have certain types of travel experiences and certain educational and cultural opportunities. So the playground became our first big project and a centerpiece. And it's a playground that is made for children of all abilities. But we've done playgrounds in other countries in areas where women and children are sheltered in place for their own physical safety. We've built outdoor spaces behind, fences that are 12 feet high so that children can still get outside and have fresh air. We have a partnership with the YMCA where we are helping Black and brown children who can't afford it get free swim lessons because, believe it or not, those children drown 4 to 5 times as much as their white peers. And so in our initial program pilot with the YMCA of Greater Seattle, more than 100 children in just the last year and a half have gotten free water safety lessons and have learned how to swim. So looking for those opportunities to stand in the gap for children, we know the elementary school years are those pivotal years where exposure makes all the difference. And so where we can offer exposure through some of the mission work we partner with, through schools, through other nonprofit organizations to help children have that advantage. That's the work that we do. And we've been blessed in our short time to do work on 3 continents and have been able to donate more than $425,000 so far.
That's awesome. And this is a nonprofit organization. People can give.
Yes.
How do they do that?
Yes, you can go to gabrielleswings.org, or you can Google Gabrielle's Wings and it will come up. But yes.
And every time that you're able to partner with another city or YMCA, Gabrielle's memory lives on. Because I even see, as we're doing this with you, you were talking about Gabrielle's playground. It's a big sign with butterflies on either side at one of your projects. So her name is right there.
It's beautiful.
It's beautiful.
Thank you. No, absolutely. We have a really cool resource center in a township in Cape Town, South Africa, that has a big picture of her on the front of it. And it's a place that became even more important during COVID. It's a technical resource center with laptops and iPads and that sort of thing. And during COVID, where kids did not have technology or Wi-Fi in their homes, they were able to come to the resource center and use it. And I get pictures from there from time to time. So that is my joy.
Wow. How can people follow along with what's happening via either, your personal social accounts, or if you've got accounts set up for Gabrielle's Wings, what's the best way for people to stay in touch and keep up with the impact you're making?
Yes, thank you. So on Instagram, Gabrielle's Wings, we do have an Instagram page, my personal page, and I talk a lot about the work that I'm doing and also some of the things in the book that I think are important for people who are dealing with grief. And so my personal handle is at MDHORD. So okay. Michelle, doctor, medical doctor, HOR doctor, although I'm not a doctor. So that's the way they can follow up with me. And I've been very blessed by direct messages from people all over the country who feel like the book has helped them. And that's been a blessing to me.
No doubt it's going to help a lot of people. And we just really appreciate you for taking the time to not just tell your story again, because I know it's painful to relive that every time you tell it. But at the same time, what you've written here in this book, The Other Side of Yet, is life-changing material for somebody who's going through a lot of grief. We got one more question for you if you got the time.
Yes.
And my guess is it probably I know we've heard a little bit of what this answer would be with Gabrielle's Playground, but you've walked an incredible road career-wise, but also have faced some dark tragedies as well. Looking forward in your life over the next 10, 20, 30, 50 years, is there something out there, and we ask every guest the same question, is there something out there, if money wasn't an issue, if time wasn't a problem, if resources, everything was at your disposal, what is the one thing that Michelle Hord wants to accomplish before this life on this side of heaven is over?
I think to help as many children as possible feel like their only limitations are the ones they set for themselves. My mother was an educator. I, grew up hearing that, service is the rent we pay. And so the work that I get to do with these children, if money was no object, we would have playgrounds on every corner of America. So I know God is able. And so I'm excited about sharing the work, about helping more children. And so that if I were to have a legacy, I would hope it would be my faith and my fight for children.
Awesome.
Quite a legacy.
Wow. Thank you, Michelle. I tell you, the book, The Other Side of Yet, is a must read. And also go to gabrielswings.org and check out. And please, if God leads you to, give. Thank you, Michelle.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you so much for the time. I appreciate it.
God bless you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.